Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this peer exchange on a very important topic, cultural responsiveness in literacy, how to disrupt and take action and make a difference. We really appreciate you taking the time on what I'm sure was a very long day, and most of you in the classroom, and we hope it's well worth your time. We really had a very good time and worked hard to put the presentation together, and we're very pleased. We're recording. We will send out the recording link along with a link to all of the resources that we mentioned tonight in a follow-up email that comes out from Zoom. It usually comes out about the same time the next day. I'm Carolyn Jacobs. I'm in the education department at GBH, which is a department of GBH. The education department is a part of GBH, the public media station in Boston. I wanted to thank two very important funders, Nellie Mae Education Foundation and Virginia Wellington Cabot Foundation. Thank you very much for your support. GBH in Boston, public media station, produces much of the content and programs that you see on public media stations around the country in your own state. Programs like American Experience, Frontline, Nova, Masterpiece, lots of programs for kids, all originate in Boston. Two examples of programs for kids are Arthur and Molly of Denali, and you're going to learn a little bit more about Molly of Denali later on in the program. So in the education department at GBH, we work with communities to research, develop, and distribute resources to support the equitable learning and development of children and youth. And the educational resources we produce are published and accessible at no cost on PBS Learning Media. And PBS Learning Media is our other host or other sponsor tonight. pbslearningmedia.org. If you're not already familiar with it, we hope you visit the site and explore it. You'll find thousands of resources. They're supplemental to the curriculum for K-12 across the curriculum. This is a platform that was co-founded and is co-produced by GBH and PBS. And the content on the site, one of the main features are very short video clips that are aligned to a standard, tell a complete story, and also with support materials that go along with that. The inspiration for tonight is Dr. Bailey's memoir, Forever Free, published in 2021, which I stumbled upon in the new nonfiction section of my local public library. The book is a call to action, an intimate look at America's long-standing struggle to adequately educate vulnerable children, and it offers valuable insights for affecting change in families, communities, and nationwide. I devoured the book and I heartily recommend it. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Bailey with us this evening. Dr. Bailey, author of Forever Free and the founder and executive director of Freedom Readers. And you'll learn more about Freedom Readers in the program. And I want to thank Dr. Bailey for introducing us to her colleague, Michelle Burgess. Michelle is a secondary ELA teacher in South Carolina, and she is a Freedom Readers tutor. All right, so the plan tonight is Dr. Bailey is going to kick things off and go through some of the basics of what culturally responsive teaching is all about, which was a very popular question that you submitted, and then also show some ways that what it looks like in K-8 classrooms. And then Michelle will follow with how culturally responsive teaching can look in middle and high school classrooms and give some very specific examples. I'll come on at the end for a few final remarks, and then we're going to have a discussion, an open discussion from 8 to 8:15. Now, we have built into the program time for reflection and questions and answers. That's very important in these peer exchanges to have as much interaction as possible. So we use the chat, we use Jamboard, and we use the Q&A feature of Zoom. Angelica from the education department is behind the scenes. She's monitoring things. And when we pause, she will feed questions to the presenters, and they'll respond and whatever. And then you are welcome also to post things in the chat in the Q&A. The Jamboard, you also have the link for that. Some of you have already posted on Jamboard. You can put questions on that also, and we'll pull that up and share that during the open questions at the end. In the open questions at the end also, I want you to take advantage of the raising hand feature, and we can call on you individually at the end in that 8 to 8:15 period of time. All right, we're going to get started. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Bailey.
Carolyn, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. It is such an honor for me to be with you this evening. I have been looking forward to our time together for weeks because I know that a lot of you on this webinar are educators, and educators happen to be my favorite people in the world. And I will tell you that I just celebrated a birthday over the weekend, so this is a part of my birthday present to be here with you this evening. I started my career in education as a high school English teacher in 1995, and I am in awe of the individual and the collective power that teachers hold. And I'm a little bit sometimes frustrated by the challenges that teachers face, especially in this current climate, where education seems more and more politicized every day. But let me tell you a little bit about me. Thank you for those birthday wishes. After spending almost a decade in the classroom, can we see her instead of this screen? That's a question that just popped up in the chat. After spending almost a decade in the classroom, I traveled around the country as an educational consultant with companies like the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education, the Leadership and Learning Center, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and Achieve 3000. At the same time that I was doing that work, I took classes toward a PhD in language and literacy and finished that degree in 2013. The culmination of all of those experiences and all of the skills that I was able to build is a nonprofit that I founded in 2010 called Freedom Readers, which I'll describe in more detail shortly. Most of what I just mentioned briefly is outlined in more detail in my book, Forever Free, A True Story of Hope in the Fight for Child Literacy. I invite you to pick up a copy and continue the conversation with me once you've had a chance to check it out. So now let's circle back to the title of this presentation. Support literacy with cultural responsiveness, disrupt and take action. In essence, this is what my entire career in education has been about. And in my quest to achieve this goal, I've encountered texts that have resonated with me and allowed me to craft a concrete vision of how the love for reading, writing, and speaking can best be cultivated in young people, especially young people living in low-income communities. So Caroline, I think you can flip the slide now. Dr. Geneva Gay's 2000 book, Culturally Responsive Teaching, Theory, Research, and Practice, is one of those foundational texts that informed my decisions as I created Freedom Readers, an after-school and summer literacy program that has positively impacted hundreds of young people to this date. Now, what I want to pause and say here is that Dr. Gay defines culturally responsive teaching as having two very important branches. First of all, culturally responsive teaching must lead to academic success, while at the same time, it allows learners to achieve, establish, and maintain a level of cultural competence. Carolyn, we can move forward. And so, as I mentioned, Dr. Gay's work has been very influential on me, along with Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings and Dr. Lisa Delpit. Their writing and their research really helped me to think through what I wanted to create in terms of helping kids read better and embrace literacy. The work that continues to inform what I do with Freedom Readers comes from thinkers like Bettina Love, who is the co-founder of the Abolitionist Teaching Network. And I also really am inspired by the work of Gholdy Muhammad, and we'll hear more about them in just a little while. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you what Dr. Gay refers to as descriptive characteristics of culturally responsive teaching or culturally responsive pedagogy. These descriptive characteristics are, it's empowering, it's validating, it's comprehensive, it's multidimensional, transformative, and emancipatory. And so I share these characteristics because these are the things that helped me create this after school and summer literacy program. And they're also the characteristics that you can think about and ask yourself, is the learning space that I'm creating culturally responsive? And these are, some of the guideposts and benchmarks that you can use when you think through that. In a moment, we'll take a look at how each of these characteristics applies to Freedom Readers and how they have been applied to K-8 classrooms across disciplines. First, I want to say a bit more about the Freedom Readers After School and Summer Literacy Program as a disruptor and a place where research has been put into action. One of our mottos at Freedom Readers is that we are school but not school. We believe that the physical location of our sites is important because many of them are not in school buildings. For many caregivers who didn't experience success in school, location really matters. And many schools have become what some refer to as militarized zones, where we have armed guards and metal detectors. For some kids, the building themselves represent a lack of affirmation and care. So we choose to situate ourselves in communities where we can embrace young people and celebrate their strengths. Carolyn, I think you can go to the next slide. So we're also able to pair one scholar with one tutor, giving participants a chance to personalize and customize in unique ways. We found that this approach allows scholars to focus and drastically cuts down the time we spend talking about behaviors. We also utilize the research on success in teaching literacy by adopting a theme for each of our 10-week sessions. And we also focus on building home libraries. We offer 3 10-week sessions per year, spring, summer, and fall. Brain research tells us that the brain is a pattern-seeking organism, so that the themes help us to organize our literacy work. And findings published in journals like Social Science Research in 2019 show that filling a child's home with books positively impacts their future academic growth and job attainment. So now let's jump into a discussion of these descriptive characteristics. I'm anxious to share just a few simple ideas with you that might help you step up your disrupt and take action game. I'll be moving quickly and touching on big ideas at a high level here, so don't forget to drop your questions in the chat. I'll pause and address anything that you want me to circle back to in just a moment. So first, let's consider that culturally responsive teaching is empowering. In other words, our choices as teachers lead to courage and personal confidence in learners, not just compliance. At Freedom Readers, scholars are empowered to read words that may not have been a part of their working vocabulary before they read our theme song or our common text. We choose a theme song that goes along with the theme so that it adds energy to our setting. And we either sing that song, but we always look at the lyrics and we always read those lyrics together. Empowerment also shows up in the speeches that they make. Now, in the classroom, students can also read together out loud. They can read short paragraphs that capture the main idea or key learning. They can be generated by the teacher or found elsewhere. Teacher-generated paragraphs are referred to as essential summaries by Augusta Mann, who has helped teachers cultivate excellence in urban classroom for decades. You can visit successfulteachers.com to learn more about essential summaries and other strategies in Mann's culture-centered approach. The second strategy that you can use in your classroom starting tomorrow is a strategy that Evelyn Rothstein calls metacognition. Here's an example on the next slide. Students are simply given a sentence frame and asked to complete the frame with their own learning and given the opportunity to present this short paragraph as a speech. So in the last session of Freedom Readers over the summer, we talked about agriculture. And so we gave young people this frame. I know that I know something about agriculture. And they could fill in that blank with anything that they wanted to fill it in with. It had to be something that they gained from one of our sessions or our time together. I believe that this strategy is very easily adaptable, and it empowers young people to be able to share their learning with others, and it gives them a sense of responsibility. They know they're taking a risk in their learning, but with the frame, they're given a scaffold for being able to share that learning. Now, next, let's consider that culturally responsive teaching is multidimensional. That means that instruction is responsive to cultural diversity and includes various perspectives and disciplines. At Freedom Readers, we build each 10-week session around a theme, and we use art, music, video clips, and other means to explore that theme. This approach translates in the classroom by having teachers work together to teach a concept, or by bringing music, photographs, or poetry into a science lesson on seed germination, for example. Let's move to the next slide, Carolyn. So in this scenario, a math teacher can use an article on Black farmers to discuss percentages. Carolyn, if we could click through to the article very quickly. I just want to show you how easy it is to find an example of an article that might relate to something that you're teaching in the classroom. As I said earlier, we talked about agriculture at Freedom Readers, and this particular article gives us photographs, pieces of art we consider that shows us an aspect of farming that we may not have thought about. It's a very quick way for us to get to the concept or the theme and help all the young people in the room think through this particular concept. But in the very beginning of this article, it talks about how 1 in 7 farmers in America today is Black. And so a math question could be, what does that mean? How does 1 in 7 translate? How can we talk about this in terms of fractions and percentages? So let's move on here and think for a minute about how culturally responsive teaching is validating. And for me, I believe this is the heart and soul of what we're considering here. That means that instruction is relevant to and effective for all students, including our students of color. Our interest inventories give us an insight into what is going to resonate with learners. These can be customized and utilized in classrooms as well. But at Freedom Readers, we have an on-site library that features books that reflect student interest and also highlights people of color. In the classroom, you can provide visuals or videos or articles that reflect the concept that you're talking about, but also includes people of color, as well as the interest of all the students in the room. On the next slide, we'll see an example of what our interest inventory looks like. And I can tell you that we look at these, and this allows us to shape what it is that we share for all of the young people who attend our meetings. This can also give classroom teachers a good background on how they can shape their lessons and what can be included to stimulate student interest. So I think this is a good time for us to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions in the chat or on the Jamboard. Angelica, is there anything that we can address here? Carolyn, do you have any questions that you want to pitch?
I do. Angelica, you may be muted if you wanted to unmute and say anything. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions.
I sent over a question for you, Tracy,
Okay.
in chat.
All right, Angelica, would it be okay for you to read that question out loud?
Sure. The question is this a program that someone can get CE, which I'm guessing is continuing education credits for?
I think that right now, at this point, it probably isn't on any of the rosters for continuing education. We are a grassroots organization that got started in 2010, and right now we're still continuing to reach the young people in our surrounding community. So I don't know of any situations where that's the case, but maybe that's not always going to be fact. Maybe we can work on that. There is a link that will be shared to the interest inventory. It's available on the Freedom Readers website as well.
Tracy, I'm going to throw out a question to you. We had many questions. I think I forgot to mention this, that were submitted with the registration, over 100. And Tracy and Michelle did see a sampling of those questions over the weekend, and they tried to work some of their responses into their presentation. But here's something, and this was a fairly common question. How can we best assist our students who want to see a representation of who they are in the curriculum?
Carolyn, that's such a wonderful question. I'm glad that you asked that. I think in some of the examples that I shared earlier, I tried to show how bringing in things like music and photography and art, focusing mostly on that multi-dimensional aspect of culturally responsive teaching, is just a really great way to help students understand that you see them and that they are a part of the curriculum. Also, inviting them to bring in their own stories and their own lived experiences is another fantastic way to make sure that we really are respecting and highlighting the experiences of all of the young people that we are reaching.
And then
Thanks,
I have I just have a very basic question about Freedom Readers that I thought some people might not have even thought to ask. Do you have a recommendation of any software or tips for monitoring your volunteer tutors and training and teaching and recruiting? So is there any systems that you can recommend if people are interested in learning more about how Freedom Readers works?
That's another fantastic question. I know that Angelina Hunt is taking part in this particular webinar this evening, and she is our Director of Operations. We've worked extremely hard over the last few months to make sure that we have some software and some online training for anyone who's interested in it. We built this from scratch through an online platform called Moodle. And so if anyone is interested in taking advantage of that, we would very much like to get you plugged in. Just go to our website at freedomreaders.org and contact us, and we can get you on your way.
Great.
All right, Carolyn and Angelica, those were wonderful questions. I am going to very quickly touch on the remaining 3 descriptive characteristics of culturally responsive teaching as described by Geneva Gay, and then we'll pause for questions again. Okay, Are we ready to go?
Yes.
Great, great. So moving ahead with the descriptive characteristics now, consider that culturally responsive teaching is comprehensive. And that means that cultural resources are used to teach intellectual development, social, emotional, and political learning, and a host of other aspects. Gay explains this attribute by pointing to an educator's ability to develop a sense of community, camaraderie, and shared responsibilities among students. At Freedom Readers, we invite scholars to study our criteria for public speaking and offer each other feedback on their way toward mastery. This could be done through video recordings in the classroom until a strong sense of community is established. So as I mentioned earlier, creating space for students to make speeches about their learning and then giving them the opportunity to master public speaking and the content of those speeches is something that we highly recommend. On the next slide, I think you will see our criteria for effective presentations. And at Freedom Readers, the young people will say to one another, you did a really good job of making a plan and following the plan, but you really didn't project your voice. Maybe next time you could project your voice a little bit more. In the classroom, until there is a sense of community and safety, you could have students record their speeches and respond to one another digitally or electronically. Next, I want you to consider that culturally responsive teaching is transformative. And that's a cute picture of us working on our speeches at Freedom Readers. In other words, culturally responsive teaching is disruptive in the sense that it explicitly respects and highlights the cultures and experiences of African American, Latinx, Asian, Native American learners in ways that schools historically have not. One of the things that we have to remember is students must excel academically so that they are prepared to critique inequalities in society. Academic success is a non-negotiable. At Freedom Readers, we are deliberate about sharing books with our scholars that show them how they can utilize their high-level literacy skills to change the world. In classrooms, teachers can facilitate academic success and make it an accessible goal by having students record their written assignments, transcribe them, and work with these texts to improve their knowledge of grammatical conventions. I think on the next slide, I shared a couple of books that are books that we love when it comes to the aspect of being transformative. One is called Speak Up, and one is called Stand Tall, Molly Lou Lemon. I'm super excited about the fact that there are many books being published now that can encourage young people to be courageous change agents, and many books that just feature young people of color, characters of color, and just address the need for us to stand up for social justice. Finally, consider that culturally responsive teaching is emancipatory. That means that it frees learners from the constraints of tradition and the acceptable canon. It means we don't have to only read the texts that have been considered essential, and individualism and competitiveness do not have to rule our interactions in the classroom. Educators are free to help students of color find their own voices, and students are free to focus more closely on academic learning tasks because they know that they're being seen, validated, and respected in the classroom. At Freedom Readers, we offer window and mirror text, which allows scholars to see into another's experience as well as see their own reflected. In the classroom, this can be done as well. Michelle will talk more about Emily Stiles' concept of window and mirrors in a minute, but I want you to consider incorporating students' communication styles into your instructional practices. When possible, invite students to write a song or a rap that can reflect their learning. This is a story about my own personal child. Whenever a teacher would invite him to do that in the classroom, whether it be a science classroom or a math classroom, I really feel like he got more out of that experience because it's something that he loved and something that just really aligned with who he was or who he is as a person. I hope this discussion of the 6 descriptive characteristics of culturally responsive teaching has been beneficial. We hope you'll reflect on these ideas as you design your next lessons, and we hope you'll share your insights with us after the talk. Now let's pause and address some comments and questions before we turn this over to Michelle.
I have some questions that have been selected ahead of time, but Angelica, is there anything in the Q&A or chat that you wanted to call attention to?
Yes, there are. There are a few questions. All right. All right, Tracy, we have a question from Catherine. What does Freedom Writers do to include families, especially families who do not read in English, and bring them into a partnership that helps grow their students' skills?
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for that question. It is a wonderful, wonderful question. So we spend a good portion of our funds on texts that can be read in both English and in Spanish. We've also worked really hard on translating all of the documentation that we share with communities into Spanish. And we are always on the hunt for finding bilingual tutors to work with our scholars who speak more than one language. The first part of your question was about families and how we include them. So we are situated, as I said earlier, in a lot of cases, inside of community centers or churches. And Michelle will talk to you a little bit about our middle school program, where we have dinner together in the evenings, and we might invite parents to sit with us for that dinner as we talk about some of the texts that we are addressing, and we talk about what students are facing in their academic journeys. So we do a lot to try to reach out to families, especially at the beginning when we have our intro calls with some of the families, and we ask parents to tell us what are your particular concerns and how can we help you address those concerns. So those are just a couple of ways that we try to embrace families. I think we can take about one more question because I don't want to eat into the time of my colleague Michelle, because she has some fabulous information to share. But then at 8 o'clock, I'll be happy to answer more.
Yeah, I have one more question from Troy. What are some ideas that we can use to be a disruptor of centering inequities in media literacy?
So Troy wants to know how we are thinking about media literacy and how we can be disruptive in that area, correct? I'm just trying to clarify and make sure I understand what the question is asking. My first initial response to that question is take a look at some video clips. Thank you, Troy. I'm glad that I got that right. I love having the opportunity to sit with young people and look at pieces of media like video clips or different websites, slices of social media, and just take the time to critique those and talk about the source of this information and how some of that information can be biased. I know that the Poynter Institute itself has set aside a website for media literacy that is run by young people. And so if you look up the Poynter Institute website, you might find more information on how they can guide educators through their media literacy discovery journeys.
Thank you, Tracy. We're going to move on to Michelle now. And I also would like to mention to Troy in particular and to all of you that there are many, many resources about media literacy on PBS Learning Media. And there are also a lot of culturally responsive resources, but that's another place that you can look. Okay. Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Burgess, and I am so excited to be here for a few reasons. The biggest reason is that I am a lifelong reader. My mother often tells this story of how I learned to read. I was 2 years old, and apparently I realized that everyone except me in my household, including my elderly grandmother, could read. And according to my mother, I just wasn't having that. So she worked with me every night until I was able to read. And that love of reading was instilled early on. I actually did not realize how much of an avid reader she was until I was a little bit older in middle school. And I realized that she liked to stay up and read books late at night too, just like me. So literacy and reading are my loves, so much so that I became a high school English teacher. And when I heard about this wonderful organization called Freedom Readers, founded by someone from a community very much like mine, one that has its own struggles, I knew that I had to be a part of it. And I began volunteering with the classic Freedom Readers program as a tutor. I read with, she was in first grade, I think, when I first started. She's now in fifth grade. I read with my scholar, and it was a great experience until one day Dr. Bailey approached me with an opportunity, the opportunity to help begin the pre-AP Freedom Readers program. This program was centered on middle schoolers. We wanted to create something that helped middle school students recognize that they could become AP students when they're in high school. Just because they may be potential first generation college students doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to get there. So we started work on the program. We created a program that was centered around one book. In the classic Freedom Readers model, each scholar takes home a book every day that they are with their tutor. For our model, we selected one book, and that book was the focus of our session. So we would have some time together at the beginning. Students would receive tutoring from high school students or teachers. I was one of the teachers and one of the tutors. And then we would actually have family dinner. And around our family dinner, students would provide a rose and a thorn. So something that is really positive, something that happened unexpectedly that made them happy. And the thorn would potentially be something that may have been a little tricky. These were middle schoolers. Unfortunately, we launched about 3 weeks before the shutdown in 2020. So we're still working to kind of bring the pre-AP program back, but I just wanted to share some of the things that we did learn while we were up and running, and some of the things that I personally do in my own classroom. I think we can go to, thank you. So one of the things that is most important to me is presenting, as Dr. Bailey mentioned, mirrors and windows. One of the first anecdotes about reading in Dr. Bailey's book is actually her anecdote about seeing herself in canonical literature and how surprised she was to be so engaged with these texts that were pretty old. And that's one of the things that every teacher wants. Every teacher wants to see that engagement. However, that engagement does not, no matter what we may hope and believe, it's not something that comes out of nowhere. We have to work to inspire that. And we do that by creating mirrors and windows. And I will discuss what a mirror is first. So mirrors are texts that reflect the reader's life and or experiences. And I do want to pause because I know as a secondary teacher that we have some unique barriers to presenting mirrors for our students. We have high stakes testing. For those of you at the middle school level, it seems like you are testing year long from my perspective. And at the high school level, we have seasonal testing. And because of that, sometimes we are encouraged to use formulas for reading and writing. We encourage students to look for the roadmap. We tell them in the first paragraph, you will find the thesis statement at the very end all the time. The topic sentence is going to be the mini claim. We teach students these things to help them for these assessments, but they're a bit out of context. In addition to those types of strategies and formulas for reading and writing, we also have things like preparing students for high school. In my district, we have what are called program schools, and program schools pretty much provide an opportunity for students to pick a path for themselves. My school is a career and technology education center. We have STEM majors, we have arts majors. Students come in as juniors and they major in a subject area. We have pre-medicine, we have pre-engineering, and they're with those specific majors teachers for 3 blocks out of the school year. So preparing students for that application process, preparing them for the interview process. For some of our majors, they even have to have products before they even apply. Some of that kind of takes away from our opportunities to present mirrors to our students. And this is, I actually think this may have popped up in the chat already. Most school districts have a required reading list, or at least a suggested novel and playlist. Sometimes it's very short, and we are either told or strongly encouraged to stick to the list. And to not deviate from that list. And these are all some of the barriers to presenting our students with opportunities to see themselves and their experiences within their reading. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the text. I apologize if this is a negative transportation back to your past, but these are some of the texts that I'm currently working with my English 4 honors students at my school. All canonical. Many of you probably read them or studied them yourselves when you were in school, and they are still on reading lists. Next slide, please. So in crafting the pre-AP program, we wanted to present opportunities for students to see themselves. And so we selected the book Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. And we selected this book for a few reasons. Next slide, please. Number one, we had a middle school age protagonist. Although the primary setting is in the 1960s, having a middle school age protagonist made the book a bit more accessible to students. It's also set in South Carolina, and even though it's set in upstate South Carolina, we were able to kind of ground students in the knowledge that this is a book, and it's actually partially a memoir. This is a book by someone who is from here. It also covers historical and cultural touchstones. You would be amazed at the number of students who don't actually have a great idea of Martin Luther King Jr. and his beliefs and all of the marches that he was involved in. And this selecting this book allowed us to kind of do a history lesson, a culturally relevant history lesson for our students, because as we educators and adults know, there's nothing new under the sun. What has happened continues to happen. The other reason that we selected this book is because it was written in verse. We had some students who were voracious and avid readers who already had their own books that they were reading, but other students were a little more hesitant, and we felt it would be a bit more approachable for students to have a book of poems rather than a traditional narrative. And more students were at least able to do the reading right before we began, if not the night or days before. Most students were able to at least work in the sections that we required for them right before we started. Next slide, please. So windows present opportunities through which readers can explore new perspectives, very necessary for all of our students. And although there is a growing focus on nonfiction at all levels, canonical fiction is still the primary focus of secondary schools. And to be perfectly honest, it presents a very narrow mirror that excludes many populations. Most pieces of canonical literature were written by older white men. And that is something that we cannot avoid, and we should not avoid, because they present a worldview. That's why it's our job to present multiple worldviews for our students. And the first way that I do that in my personal classroom is actually something that Dr. Bailey already mentioned: interest inventories. My interest inventories look a bit different because I do teach high school students. I ask them if they have access to the internet at home, if they have a job, if they play sports, if they're involved in other extracurricular activities. I ask them what was the last full-length book they read, which you would be surprised how many students list books that were definitely on their 3rd and 4th grade reading list. My students are all juniors and seniors at this point, and they admit that the last time they read a full-length book without the aid of SparkNotes or Shmoop was in elementary school. And they will tell me very blatantly that it's because that's the last time I liked reading. And as a lifelong lover of reading, it is often difficult to hear them say that. And I think some of them say it for the shock factor, but what they don't know is that I'm ready for them. After doing this for so many years, I am completely prepared for the pushback, for the why do we need English class? Why do we have to read every day? My students read every day for at least 15 minutes. I'm prepared for the pushback because I have a secret weapon. I'm a book whisperer. My book whisperer is Michael Easler. He is the media specialist at my school, and none of my students believe me until the first day that we walk into the library. I tell them, whatever you're interested in, let me know, and I'll let Mr. Easler know. If you're afraid to talk to him, I will be your go-between, but he will find a book for you. He will find a book that you will love. And he does. I have never, ever had a single student return to me and say that he could not find a book for them. And he typically gets some of his recommendations for a diverse text from kirkusreviews.com, hbook.com, and slj.com. He also is a voracious reader himself. He's always reading something. And not only does he recommend books to students, he also recommends books for teachers. He learns our interests. He asks, what are you teaching in class? And this is for any of the teachers in the building, our science, history, our majors teachers. He always wants to know what we're doing in our classroom so that he can fill our media center with texts that are relevant to what we're doing in our classroom. But his first priority is actually to the students, to finding things that interest them, to nurturing those who already love reading and kind of coaxing those who are a little shyer about reading. Something else that we can do to present opportunities for windows for our students is to consider who's telling the story and who's being left out. As an English teacher, talking about perspective and assuming someone else's identity or their perspective when discussing a text is common nature. But with history classes as well, you also encourage students to think about the winner. Think about the fact that history is told from the perspective of the winner. That's something that can be considered even in a science class. If you are talking about traits that can be genetic traits that can be passed on from parent to child, something to consider is illnesses and ailments that affect certain groups more than others. And this is where getting to know your students really well comes in handy. That interest inventory, while it seems a bit surface level, the more you ask them about their interests, the more you pull in the things that they're interested in, the more likely they are to open up to you about the things that matter, about their homes, about their cultural identity. But we have to do that work on the front end. I think with everything that is happening, it's pretty easy sometimes to get caught up in the paperwork, get caught up in masks and sanitizing things. But ultimately, that responsibility, that onus is on us to make sure that our students feel safe enough to reveal themselves to us. The other thing that I do in my classroom to present windows is that I supplement that canonical literature with nonfiction, specifically historical and modern connections. With the Canterbury Tales, I was actually looking for a fictional text that could kind of supplement as a modern retelling of the Canterbury Tales. But what I found instead is something called the Refugee Tales. And I believe the article about that, that project is linked in the presentation. The Refugee Tales actually is an account of refugees in Europe who are going on a miniature version of a pilgrimage. They're going on a 9-day walk. And over the course of that walk, much like the characters in the Canterbury Tales, they are relating their stories of immigration. They are relating their stories of how they came to become refugees in a strange land. So pulling this text in, number one, it was a very clear, this was purposeful. Refugee Tales is based on the Canterbury Tales. They drew inspiration from it, but it also forced students to think outside of the canon, outside of this group of fictional characters going on a pilgrimage to Sir Thomas Becket's tomb. These are real people. These are real people who've been displaced. These are real people who are fleeing violence, who are fleeing conflict, and this is their journey. This is the story of their journey. So while the types of stories differ between the Canterbury Tales and the Refugee Tales, the impact is still the same. We're still learning more about, in the case of the Canterbury Tales, a different time period and the values that they held. And in the case of the Refugee Tales, we're learning about the trials that others face. A more modern connection that I made with Beowulf, actually, again, looking for modern connections. There is a very interesting editorial written in 1978 about Muhammad Ali's last fight as heavyweight champion. It's actually when he lost the title. And I did some reading. I had to do my research because I don't know sports at all, especially not boxing. And I only knew what everyone pretty much knows about Muhammad Ali, about his activism, about his braggadocious nature. Those were the only things that I really knew. But in conducting my research, because I went down a rabbit hole as I tend to do, I found out some things about Muhammad Ali and where this nature came from. And the editorial was written by an English teacher, actually. It actually puts a lot of things into perspective on why he felt the need to brag, on how proud he was of his humble beginnings in Kentucky and how he shouted out Kentucky whenever he could in the small community that he was from. And that led my class into a conversation on why Beowulf brags or boasts in the text. Boasting is how you show respect for where you're from. In the case of Beowulf, the king who had sent him on this journey. In the case of Muhammad Ali, Kentucky, where he's from. And it's also a part of your reputation because you are saying, these are the things that I am capable of and I will accomplish them. So in bringing in a new text, a nonfiction text, I was able to help them see that although they were both boasting and the outcomes were a little different, it's all connected. We're all connected, despite the fact that there is a millennium separating Muhammad Ali from the text of Beowulf. We are all interconnected. And along those same lines, I had them write their own boast. I actually wrote a boast from the persona of Muhammad Ali right before that 1978 fight. There's tons of research. I was actually taken aback by how much research had been compiled from interviews and discussions with him on his thought process, because he lost his title. And for someone who valued his role as a fighter as much as Muhammad Ali did, it was pretty tragic for him. So in doing my research, I assumed his persona, because some of my students did not want to write a boast. They did not believe that they had anything to boast about. So I told them, if you would like to, you could assume the persona of someone else. You could perhaps open a sliding glass door and take on someone else's identity and kind of explore that. I will pause right here for a second to see if there are any questions, either in the chat or Carolyn, do you have any questions for me?
I think, yeah, there are lots of questions, but let's move on to finish your presentation. Yeah, and then we'll have a block of time for questions, Michelle. Yep.
All right. And yes, you can move on to the next slide. So this was actually my most recent foray into interdisciplinary collaboration, and also attempting to provide a window for my students. While reading the Canterbury Tales, I had them writing, of course, and some of my art students, because again, we have majors, some of my art students wanted something creative to do. They wanted some sort of creative project. So I was looking for artwork inspired by the Canterbury Tales. I didn't find anything that I personally was interested in. That's also something to keep in mind. We have to continue to be invested in this. I have a stack of fiction and nonfiction that's very modern and will probably never ever make it onto the approved reading list for my district. So I have to find ways to continue engaging with canonical literature myself. But I discovered some information regarding Kehinde Wiley. And Kehinde Wiley, you probably know that name and definitely his style, because he actually was commissioned to produce former President Barack Obama's official portrait. And he specializes in placing Black and brown subjects in traditionally Renaissance and kind of historically relevant poses. And he juxtaposes those traditional poses with, number one, the Black or brown subject, who is almost always missing from the halls of the museums where these Renaissance paintings are, but also their attire, where the location where they're shooting. And his whole purpose is to kind of disrupt the status quo, to kind of interject and say, hey, I know that you believe that this is history, but there were others there too. And this is our current reality. So I paired with my colleague, good friend and former art teacher. She was my middle school art teacher, Leslie Etherson. She's also the web and digital communications teacher at my school. And her students took photographs of my students. My students were assigned characters from the Canterbury Tales, and they were instructed to strike a pose. They were instructed to strike a Renaissance style pose. And then Miss Etherson's students edited those photos. And what's on your screen is one of those student productions. This encouraged my students to look beyond what is and imagine what could be. Again, I completely get their anxiety about reading canonical literature. We actually read Othello as well. And, you know, most students are terrified of Shakespeare, but I believe that beginning with Beowulf and beginning with the Canterbury Tales and pulling in culturally responsive texts, nonfiction specifically, help them see that the text is just part of it. interacting with the text is where you really find the meaning, is where you make your meaning. Next slide, please. And the future. This is what we hope to continue to do. Again, the Freedom Readers pre-AP program sought to prepare middle school students for admission to advanced placement courses in high school and continued success in general education and honors level courses. So my suggestions to you, for those of you who would like to kind of begin to shift the needle a bit in your own classrooms and maybe even in the programs that you volunteer with or sponsor, continue book selection. Our students have so very little choice of their own, especially at the secondary level. It's like we're trying to get them through to adulthood, and we forget that even adults like to have choice. We like to have options as well. My students do read for at least 15 minutes each day, and they select their own books. In the past, and with my advanced placement course, I also teach AP language and composition. I do sometimes have a required genre, but they are able to select options from that genre. But for my English 4 honors course, they select their own books. Traditional tutoring with high school students and teachers. I think this is beneficial for both middle and high school students, as just the thought of, especially with the high school students, having a peer be able to help you. And from the middle school perspective, our scholars who were a part of the pre-AP program, they almost looked in wonder at these big high schoolers who were coming from basketball practice to help tutor them. Whole group novel discussions, definitely continue to do what we know is just good practices, and not only talking about the whole class novel, but also taking time to talk about their book selection, the books that they have chosen to read. Vocabulary work with the novels. I will say that I shied away from vocabulary work for a few years, but it is meaningful, especially when you choose the vocabulary in context. You select words, you show them those vocabulary words in the context of whatever major text you're reading. And it's almost like an Easter egg hunt to see how often a kid can say, hey, I saw that word. Hey, remember, countenance means this. And I actually saw countenance on Twitter yesterday. It becomes almost like a scavenger hunt for them to see how many people can see our vocab words out in the wild. Again, lessons on major historical events with the novels. And then again, get to know your students, discussions on the roses and thorns, not just of middle school, but also of high school. And that's it. All right, I think now we have our question and answer portion.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Such rich presentations. I'm going to do a couple of final announcements and then open it up for Q&A. And I'm going to whip through a couple of slides. I just want to show you, I haven't yet created a public version of the slides that I can share, but I will do that tomorrow. And in that email that I mentioned that you'll be getting at the end of the day tomorrow, you will have links to the survey, to the slides, to the resource document, and the resources that we're mentioning tonight. So I'm just showing you what you will have access to a little bit later. And these are some of the pertinent resources that are available on pbslearningmedia.org. We're doing a lot of work on culturally responsive teaching in STEM, as well as in other subject areas. Molly of Denali, there was a question from someone about Indigenous people and teaching them and recommendations for resources. And I highly recommend Molly of Denali. This is another collection. And again, you will have the links to all of this in your resource document. Lots of collections of resources on PBS Learning Media around literacy. These are just some examples. And we'd like you to help us do better. We have a survey that our research department puts together. It's anonymous. We encourage you to take the survey, please. Let us know how we can, what you liked, what we can do better. And also at the end of the survey, you can download a certificate of attendance if that would be helpful for you. We do pay very close attention to the surveys. All right, so Michelle, come back on camera. We are going to respond to some of your questions, and I think that they've been posted in the chat, the Q&A. I'll also pull up the Jamboard. And I want to give you an option. If you would like to raise your hand to ask a question, you are welcome to do so, and I will give you the microphone. So let's open it up for questions. Let's first check in with Angelica and see if there are some things that you would like to bring up. Angelica?
Yes, there was a question earlier that asked about how the Freedom Reader program aligned with delayed readers, so readers who were still in the process of learning.
Thank you, Angelica. I think I'll jump in here and then I'll let Michelle add on if she has any thoughts. So I think that a part of the secret sauce at Freedom Readers is the fact that we run a one-to-one reading model. And so whatever it is that a child can do in terms of literacy, they're given the opportunity to do that with their tutor. And so if they are not reading on grade level, which, you know, some of our scholars are not, then they might start with books that only have pictures in them. And they start to narrate those books for their tutor. And their tutor is definitely there to encourage them. And, you know, even if they are only reading books that have 1 or 2 words on them, the tutor's there to say, well, let's take a look at this word again, or let's talk about phonics. What sound does this letter make? And so it is really about the personalization and the customization of the reading time that we have together that I think is beneficial for all of the scholars in our program. Michelle?
I completely agree. And even taking the time to reread sections with them. My scholar is a little bit older. She's in 5th grade now, and she's been phenomenal. But sometimes she's speed reading. Sometimes I know that she's just kind of reading and not really retaining. And so sometimes just rereading with them. One of the strategies that I saw online was actually to like choral style, as Dr. Bailey mentioned, I kind of read a paragraph together. So I think those are all awesome strategies.
I'm going to jump in here with a question that I think we could crowdsource at the same time that I want Dr. Bailey and Michelle to respond to if something comes to mind. And that is, what are some good age-appropriate books that accurately reflect the cultural diversity in our society? Here's your chance to shout out some of your favorite books, attendees, and Dr. Bailey and Michelle.
Well, this could go on for a really long time. So I think I will probably limit I'll give you 3 books that I've encountered recently that I really have been enjoying. So there's a book called Ada Twist, Scientist, that I really enjoy sharing with young people, and they're excited about seeing that, and we connect that to our discussions related to STEM. There is a book that I've been sharing with a lot of young girls recently called Silwe by Lupita Nyong'o, who starred in the Black Panther movie and lots of other movies, but she's written a book about self-concept and the fact that beauty is not something that we need to be looking at on the surface, but it's something that comes from inside. That book is called Silwe. It's a picture book by Lupita Nyong'o. And there is a book that I love about Aretha Franklin's life, and it's called Respect, R-E-S-P-C-T. And the illustrations in that book are just absolutely phenomenal. So I love being able to connect our young people. A lot of them tell me, like our 9-10-year-olds say, I've never heard of Aretha Franklin. I don't know who that is. So we can read the book and then listen to some of her music, and we can connect these young people to this culture and just really enrich their lives. Because if you have not heard of Aretha Franklin, obviously you have not lived.
Michelle?
Perhaps Dear Martin by Nick Stone, and then the follow-up Dear Justice, just to kind of Dear Martin, especially blending the past with the present.
All right, I'm assuming that people are putting some things in the
Mhm.
chat. I want to give a personal shout out. The name escapes me right now because I'm caught off guard, but I'm in a book group and we just read 3 nonfiction picture and young adult books. And one is about Ruby Bridges, the young girl who was 6 years old and was the first to integrate schools in New Orleans. The second one was Claudette Colvin, who before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus. She was 16 years old at the time, and she suffered the consequences from that terribly. And the third is a beautiful picture book. I love reading picture books, on Fannie Lou Hamer. So those are 3 very powerful women activists that really resonated with me. All right, I have another question. I don't want to fight you, Angelica. If you have something you are dying to ask, please do so. Otherwise, I have a couple more.
There is one more that I think a lot of folks could gain knowledge from. This question comes from Christine. It's, do you have any suggestions for promoting these approaches and practices in a district that is less than fully ready to address inequities?
Great. Yeah, and we have a question here. I was going to ask the same thing about how to get administration and school boards on board.
So I will say this, and then I'll let Michelle chime in. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I know that education is becoming more and more politicized every day. So there are people, I'm sure a lot of us on the call understand, that are making decisions about education that are not necessarily educators and have not really embraced all that we've talked about over this time that we've had together. The only thing that I would recommend is I think that change sometimes happens from the bottom up. And I think that we have to understand as educators that we are extremely powerful individually and collectively. And we have to continue to do what we know to be right for young people. And we have to continue to, forgive me for the use of this word, but evangelize about what it means to create safe spaces for every child in the classroom. The only way I know to affect change is to work within my sphere of influence and to work one-to-one. Reach out to an administrator or a school board member, or invite somebody to lunch and try to have a conversation with them. But by all means, we have to continue to be vocal, and we have to continue to be committed and dedicated to what we know to be right. Michelle?
Precisely, Dr. Bailey. The conversations are crucial. I think a lot of the current conflict comes from a lack of understanding and a lack of listening. Sometimes those conversations happen and some people aren't in the room, so they make assumptions and they don't really know what's happening. Someone in the chat actually said, get on the summer reading committee. I definitely urge you to do that. And also to do your research. You really cannot argue with research. You cannot argue with good pedagogy. So do your research, and especially in the case of bringing culturally responsive text into the classroom, pair with your media specialists, pair with other teachers within the district. I'm sure you aren't the only person in your building or in your school who is trying to shift in this direction. So reach out and, as Dr. Bailey said, begin those conversations.
And Michelle, I love what you said there, because there is strength in numbers. And the more we can come together and create a network of sharing ideas and raising our voices together, then I think the more likely we are to see the needle move in the right direction.
Exactly.
I wanted to give the microphone to Troy Jackson, who raised his hand. Troy, do you want to speak? No? We can't hear you. Okay. I have another question. We're at the very end, but I wanted to give you another question that came in early on Jamboard from someone who registered. And that was, let me find it. When your audience is privileged and cannot relate to the plight of the underprivileged, how do you teach empathy through literacy or through literature?
Wow, I think that is a fantastic question, because I feel like one of the reasons that I'm so adamant about sharing the love of reading with young people is because reading is all about empathy. And I get to walk in the shoes of a character and see the choices that they make without having to actually suffer the consequences of those choices. So reading at the heart and in the core of literacy instruction, it's all about empathy. And I think it's probably one of the only solutions that we have in our very polarized society now, to being able to see things from another person's perspective without feeling like we're going to be attacked, or without having to defend our own position. You can pick up a book, get lost in that, and just empathy grows naturally from being saturated and just surrounded by books and taking advantage of that reading.
Exactly. We have to present those opportunities. We have to present those texts from multiple perspectives to students. It's not indoctrination. It's presenting the world as it is. And once we do that, most of our students are able to see between the lines. Most of our students are able to make those connections and to make those applications to their own lives, or to how they understand real people around them.
All right, we've come to the end. I want to thank the tremendous effort and presence that you had tonight, both Dr. Bailey and Michelle. Thank you very, very much. I feel like it sounds trite, but we're just getting started. There is so much more to talk about. On a practical point of view here, we will be going through the chat. We'll be going through Jamboard. We'll be going through the Q&A. We'll be going through the presentation and making sure that we're giving you links to everything. Again, there will be this follow-up email that comes out tomorrow that will have the link to the survey. It will have the link to the resource document, the slides, and also the recording. Then I will compile, go through the chat transcript, which typically takes me a couple of days, and try and summarize things. I think that Dr. Bailey and Michelle would be open to maybe doing a little more written response. If I send you a couple of questions that came and that were asked multiple times, I'll get a response and pass that along to the group. So look for many more of this type of conversation from GBH Education. This is my contact information here. You are welcome to email me with any questions or comments. But again, we look forward to getting your feedback on the survey. And we are particularly interested in other educators who would like to be part of our webinars as presenters. So let me know if that is of interest to you, and we'll talk about that some more. All right, I'm sorry, there are people who have raised their hand, but we have reached the end, and I want to be respectful of your time and let everybody get to bed for tomorrow morning. We'll be here before we know it. So thank you again, Dr. Bailey, Michelle, and all of you. It was a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.